Good afternoon. It's Pop again, Dennis Murray. Um, it's always a pleasure to do these things. Today is Popcast 60, and it's called Nature's Wisdom, Part 10. Um, in recent days, I talked about consequences. Nature is abundant, but also consequential. Oh, excuse me, I forgot to move the microphone down closer. At least I remembered to turn it on. So for that, we're grateful. I have to keep my glasses on today because I have to see my notes. So pardon the reflection. My apologies. So we've been talking about the consequences, and I listed a number of consequences yesterday, but I held off on finishing the list because I was afraid it was getting too dark. Um, but I really do think I need to finish the darkest possibility because I think Jung had a very good point that we can't change anything until we accept it. And it's hard to imagine, but one of the consequences of us not living wisely and not making the first step towards the other in the hope that it'll be reciprocated sooner or later in one way or another. Um, One of the consequences of not living that way is that we're not living as our species has evolved to live, and as such, we very much risk our thriving. And I listed a variety of consequences that nobody can predict, but based on history, have actually happened to humans at one time or another, including in our own case, the Civil War. In a similar circumstance where there's no external enemy for a while. In this case, the Cold War more or less ended in about 30 years ago, more or less the same time period between Andrew Jackson and the Civil War. Um, we're not going to have a civil war. We certainly not anytime soon. The ordinary good sense of the people hasn't been thrown out that much. Um, but history has taught us that very startling, harmful things can happen to us at our own hands when we stop living in hopeful expectation of each other. We stop thriving and we can start falling apart. And I want to add to that list one more thing. I'm going to tell a story first. I went to Georgetown for college and law school. I went to law school at night, as I think I've told you. Um, and I got married after my first year, so I did the remaining 3 years in too by going winter and summer because I was getting help from the family to make it possible for me to finish my education, and I wanted to get that part of my life over as soon as possible and go to work and take care of myself and my family. Um, so Gail and I were driving in the car in 1962 during what's now known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the announcers were increasingly scared, and I mean scared. I don't. I don't think you've ever heard anything quite like it. I can't remember anything like it since. Um, and so I went to church at Georgetown. There's a chapel there. Um, and the place was empty. Typically, the chapel would have been full, but a very large number of the Georgetown population came from South America, and many of them were from relatively wealthy families. Many were connected to the power system in their country. So they were getting, diplomatic insider information, and they fully expected that nuclear weapons would be launched within a very short time against Washington by Russia. And they pulled all their kids home. They got them on the first plane they could and got them out of town. And that's why the chapel was empty. Between that and uh, the voice of the announcers, it was scary. So why am I telling this story? Well, actually, I like to tell stories. I've had a fairly colorful life, and I'm old, and it's my pleasure to talk about some of it. Um, but I'm also telling it to make a point here. We almost blew up the world. We wouldn't have just stopped at succeeding in getting Washington blown up by the Russians. We would have retaliated, and they would have expanded, and we would have expanded, and there would have been nothing left. There were books written in this time period about nuclear wars that resulted in the extinction of mankind. Um, so the last worst consequence to living without hope, to giving up, to living unwisely, and giving up the way our species has evolved to live in shared hope. The last worst consequence is we could destroy the planet. Uh, we could cause our own extinction. And while it's hard now to imagine that we could engage in that kind of a nuclear exchange, um, we were pretty close in 1962, and there were some other time periods subsequently that were pretty scary. Um, there was an incredible movie made by Peter Sellers called Dr. Strangeglove, or How I Learned to Love the Bomb. And in that movie, the end of the movie is a bomb being dropped from an American nuclear bomber onto Russia, which had unfortunately built a bomb that automatically went off whenever there was a nuclear attack on Russia. And the bomb was so huge it destroyed the whole planet. It was called a doomsday bomb, and the Russians had forgot to tell us that they had built it because they had just built it and they hadn't gotten around to telling about it yet. So, of course, it's a movie, so in some regards it's silly, but nobody that saw it at that time thought it was entirely silly. And there's a lot of people behaving stupidly in it, and it was funny the way they had these people behaving stupidly. But there's actually not that much funny about destroying the planet. And so I want to say, in my own personal experience and borne out by the historians of that day, we did come pretty close to the ultimate consequence for being unwise. And it could happen. Um, And I think it's important to show the full extent of the consequences that might occur, um, because we have to accept those possibilities in order to give us the sober appreciation of how dangerous to us our current divide is and how deadly to us our hopelessness is. It's not an idle conversation. Um, it's not, oh, gee, I wish things were better. It's considerably more serious than that. So I'm going to end on a very hopeful note, and let me work up to it. The One of the things that we've been talking about in recent days is how many opportunities there are to make a move towards the other fellow in your ordinary life and in our political life. There's so many times and places in life when you'll have a bit more power. Your restraint counts for something. There's also times when you're angry and your restraint counts for something. Um, there is, in politics, there's a particular case I'm going to tell you about. I was an attorney for, about 20 years. I practiced much of that time in the small town where my wife and I were able to buy a house. Yesterday, by the way, June 30th, was the anniversary of the day we bought our first house. We were in our early 20s and we were very fortunate. Again, I'm privileged. My father lent me $3,000, which at the time was quite a lot of money for the down payment. And we were able to buy a house for, okay, hold your head now because you're not going to believe this. $20,200 was the entire purchase price. That wasn't the down payment. That wasn't the cost of a renewed kitchen. That bought a house, 3 bedrooms, 2 full baths, um, air conditioning, beautiful design. It was a Levitt house. He knew how to build a beautiful home at a good price, and he won all kinds of awards for the innovative changes in construction he made. And we were just struck with wonder and joy to be able to move into a brand new house. Um, June 30th, 1966. That's a lot of years ago. And so um, I know there was a point here. So, okay, so that put us in Bowie. And a few years later, I started practicing law in a little law firm in Bowie. And in due time, I became a partner. But partners were, our agreement was the boss helped you get started. But once you get started, you were on your own. So you kept whatever you earned and you paid each month a portion of the expenses of running the office. So basically, I worked for myself. It was a partnership in nominal terms, but in real terms, I was a sole practitioner. Um, but um, you get close to your partners, and when I joined the firm, there was just 3 of us, and in time there became 6 or 7 of us. Um, and the guy that founded the law firm and 2 other guys became judges over time, circuit court judges or district court judges in Maryland. And 3 of them were members of the Maryland House of Delegates, um, and elected political position. So they had some political power. They had some insider knowledge, and eventually 3 of them went off to become judges. There was a guy on our letterhead who never really practiced with us who became an appellate judge, and there was one of the political partners became a kind of judge, but he was actually called a commissioner. So a lot of the guys took the political route and left, and being a judge was a political matter. You had to get appointed, and then you had to stand for election. And so that's the way they went. And so there was a lot of knowledge about law and a lot of talk about it. So one of the partners explained to me a certain practice. Uh, in mid-April every year, the legislative session in Maryland ends. It's a legislature that meets full time for about 3 months in the winter, and uh, and then they meet occasionally during the rest of the year. So when the session ends, any bills that didn't get passed are over for the year, and you'll try them again next year. Well, there was the case that for gosh, many, many years now back, 60, 70 years, I guess, somewhere's in the 50s, Maryland became majority Democratic. And while we occasionally elected a Republican for governor from time to time, and we have one now that everybody in the state just thinks is fabulous, um, because he is. He's got all the good sense you could ever need, and he never seems to stop using it. So we're very grateful to have him here during this pandemic. But the legislature was controlled by the Democrats, so there was always bills that came in very late in the year because people didn't want them to have the full scrutiny that bills have when they get introduced early in the season. Uh, so, you pre-file bills in December, they start talking about them in January. No. If you're trying to pull something, then you wait till very late, and you, of course, have to be connected to the leadership to get away with this. And you put the bill in, and then now it's rushed and hardly gets consideration, but the insiders have decided they want to pass it. But they don't want to do that until the last second. Now the clock is running to midnight and the session ends when that clock hits midnight. And there literally was a great big clock on the wall in the, as far as I know, there still is. I haven't been there in 30 years, but occasionally I went and sat in the gallery and watched my partners introduce important bills or, et cetera. And I went to the parties that began at midnight on the last day of the session a couple of times. So they literally go up and have the sergeant at arms get on a ladder and turn the hands of the clock back 3, 4, 5 minutes just before midnight, so they can rush through these bills that are usually a little bit stinky. And I said to my partner, who was, kind of bragging about how they did this, he was Boston Irish, and he was, from a family that had been involved in Democratic politics for a long, long time. And, he played the game rough and dirty. And he bragged about this. He said, well, you've got the power of the gavel, you should use it. Meaning you have the majority, so you can do what you want. Well, I said at the time, that's going to end up biting you in the butt at some point. And we're at that point. That's what's going on now in our great divide. In Maryland, there's still Democrats firmly in control of the state and most of its regions. But we in Maryland, just like everybody else in the country, has got the great divide going on. Our anger at each other is such that, like everywhere, you can't talk politics with your best friends. I've been blessed by people I've been best friends with for 45, 50 years. Goodness, 3, 4, 5 couples that just go back so far is such a wonderful thing to have. But 2 of our guys just used to get at loggerheads at each other, yelling and shouting and such. And we all just said, okay, that's it. No more politics when we're getting together. When when all friends can't even talk about political differences without losing it. So my whole point is, there's all kinds of things in political life and in everyday life where you can exercise restraint. You can hold back a little bit on your power. You can hold back a little bit on your anger. You can, in so doing, be making a first step towards the other. I mean, you know how many times this comes up in family life? This comes up at work. Uh, you know, the guy in accounting is just really irritating. And if you just give him a few minutes of real time and attention, he's going to feel like, wow, okay, you actually were paying attention. And he was able to be of help to you and your work group in a certain matter. It's just as simple as that. All of these small things where you have to reach a little bit inside yourself to find the patience, to find the restraint, to find the kindness. to make, in effect, a first step. And it's seen and appreciated, and it creates this whole wonderful thing of living the gift of each other, of sharing hope, and of changing the context in which we live. Um, I've got some more stories I want to tell about this. I've got some more difficulties I want to, use as examples. Some movies and some things on Facebook recently. I just want to make this biological term ending today. This is the weird case. There's part of what the big divide is an unspoken context of science on the one side and religion on the other. And best I can figure out, it's connected to the thing that haunted is not a strong word, but has garnered a good deal of my energy and attention my whole life. And that's the problem that Darwin brings us. Um, and what I'm pointing out here is that science, particularly Darwin, has actually supported our inspirational nature. It's supported that we live as no other species does, by reciprocal kindness to each other, reciprocal withholding of personal benefit seeking, by making the first step. And in so doing, we do so hopefully that it'll be reciprocated. And when it's reciprocated, or when somebody else makes the first step towards us, then we're sharing hope. And that's an actual description of how we are. And what Darwin did was see how we are and try to figure out how to describe how we could have gotten that way by the process of natural selection. But it's not against religion for how we are to have been evolved if you believe that the creative goodness that seems to show itself in us is an external deity, and you've given it one of the names of God. Um, it's there's no problem with God using natural selection as the method to bring us to where we are. It doesn't take away one bit from religion. And what Darwin did that was inimical was to the particulars of the story of Genesis, not to the heart of the story, which was that there's a creative goodness that most people choose to personify and give one of the names of God to. Um, that part is doing just fine. And essentially, a big part of the divide is this unspoken religion versus science thing going on between the two sides. What I'm saying is that's over. Science turns out to explain how we came to be a gift to each other, how we came to have inspiration in our psychology that gives us hope, and that when we live the hope, we become a gift to each other and we thrive as a species. So biology is supporting inspiration. Darwin is supporting religion. And there were many scientists who were afraid of religion because it, in prior centuries, suppressed science. And they didn't want that to happen again. And there is still some of that fear, just as there's a fear on the part of religion that some scientists want to take all spirituality out of the world and make life meaningless. Um, but scientists are backing off on that. They've begun to realize that they were kidding themselves in thinking that they knew enough science to be able to say life has no meaning. Um, and uh, and religion has slowly come around to realize that evolution is a perfectly acceptable way for a deity to bring us to who we are. Uh, the only species in all of the billions of years of time that cares for each other in the way that we do, and that lives as a gift to each other. And so this is the really, really, change point as far as I'm concerned. This can be a way to ease some of the determination for the continuance of this divide, and to begin to look a little harder for ways to cross this divide. Um, I really do think that science has, in effect, supported religion by showing that um, we are people who live by the hope that inspiration gives us, and we live by sharing hope with each other. And the only good explanation for that is some creative goodness in the heart of our psychology. And then that leaves us with whether or not that creative goodness is external or just in our psychology. But it doesn't matter. In terms of how we live, we have to live consistently with the creative goodness that is in our psychology. Because if we don't live the way we've evolved to live, we run into the problem of perishing. Um, if we live unwisely, there's consequences to pay. And that's where we are. I'd like to skip some of those consequences and live a little more wisely. Okay, long time today. My apologies. Well, actually, you know, I, I don't, I take that back. Um, I, I think I'll continue talking um, as much as seems to be to reach the key points that I like to reach each day. And today it had to be that Darwin actually supports religion. For me personally, that's how I started all this when I was in fifth grade. I could see that was a problem and I wanted to address it. And I feel like I'm doing so. Okay, thanks so much. See you tomorrow. Bye bye.